So hi, everyone. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm really excited and honored to be here. And I think with a theme like resilience and shifting the narrative from resilience to regeneration and reciprocity, one key element of that is really about vulnerability. So I'll be vulnerable and say, even though I love speaking and doing these kinds of engagements, I always get nervous. And I think it's important to be able to say that and to have that be something that you're not worried about sharing. And I think we need to create spaces where that feels like something that can be said at any point by any person. Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for your willingness to hear me talk about something that is really important to me. So I'll get started. So I'd like to start with just a little bit of information about myself. So I am a visual artist. I am a Nigerian Canadian visual artist, policy analyst, and curator, and probably a couple other things. But the thing that resonates most with me is the title of artist. But at the moment, I'm currently based in London, UK, pursuing a master's in inequalities and social science at the London School of Economics. And I will be coming back to Ottawa in September to go back to my job in government. So people often ask me what it's like to be a visual artist and a policy analyst. And to be honest, it feels a lot like the meme on the left. I'm often trying to connect and communicate what can at times be very disparate ideas. But at the end of the day, both occupations are ultimately about storytelling. In policy, you do research in order to identify the best course of action, and then you create a narrative around it to convince those around you. You essentially pitch your policy recommendations. Sorry, I'm just going to change something really quickly. As an artist, I take things that are ephemeral, feelings, ideas, glimpses of inspiration, theoretical concepts, and I try to capture them in a visual form that speaks to and resonates with myself and the audience, that moves them and makes them feel something new and different. That being said, both processes can be messy on their own and can get even messier when I attempt to bring them together for a presentation. For this reason, I wanted to provide a bit of a roadmap so that you don't get too lost throughout the presentation. I'm going to start off with a discussion of how the narrative of resilience hurts those that it's meant to celebrate, focusing mainly on the Black experience and impacts on the body and health. Then I'm going to turn to a discussion of what it means to shift from a focus on resilience to one on regeneration, using my experience working on the development of the national food policy as a starting off point. Finally, I'll end on a discussion of how I'm pushing against narratives that focus solely on Black pain and suffering in my own personal art practice, shifting instead towards something that academic Kevin Quashie calls Black aliveness. So moving to the first section on how narratives around resilience harm those they're meant to celebrate. I'd like to start off with a definition of resilience. This one from the Rockefeller Foundation, a US-based private foundation, and work with all of you to deconstruct it. So I'd like to invite you to write your thoughts and comments in the chat box as I read out the definition. Resilience is the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of stress and shocks, and even transform when conditions require it. Building resilience is about making people, communities, and systems better prepared to withstand catastrophic events, both natural and man-made, and able to bounce back more quickly and emerge stronger from these shocks and stresses. So this seems like a simple and fair enough definition of resilience, right? What I'd like to do is actually to start deconstructing it all together. And I'd like to first start with the phrase, "in the face of stress and shocks." Notice that the way in which the phrase is used in the definition makes it such that we are made to assume that the stressors and shocks are a given. They are not named or described, but we know that by definition, stress is a form of pressure being exerted onto an object, and shocks are sudden, upsetting, or surprising events or experiences. That these stressors and shocks are immovable is reinforced by the statement, "when conditions require it," which makes it clear that it is for the individuals, the communities, and the systems in question to adapt to these events, and that they may even be required to, and this could involve force. The next statement, to withstand catastrophic events, both natural and man-made, is an interesting one because in some ways it puts man-made and natural disasters on the same level, which gives man-made disasters the air of also being inevitable and unquestionable. Any question of responsibility for these events is evaded through this juxtaposition. Through it all, it's clear that it's for the individuals, the communities, and the systems to do the changing. They're the ones that are meant to survive. They're the ones that are meant to adapt and grow and even transform in order to withstand these stresses and shocks. The language that is used to describe the actions these actors must take, and this is important because there's no other option that's being provided. It's either that you change and you adapt, or if you can't, then you can't survive. And the language survive is actually quite key because what is the alternative of survival? It's death. And if these stressors are seen as immovable, then in order to actually live, in order to avoid death, you must change yourself. And the way that the language that continues with the definition, it's language that's not actually neutral. It's language that's meant to celebrate the actions that these actors have to take on. It's language like being able to bounce back more quickly, emerge stronger. It's language that seems to celebrate the fact or even kind of commend these actors for the fact that they're doing the work of changing themselves in order to survive, rather again than questioning why these systems have been built in such ways, why it is that particular groups of people are more vulnerable to these stresses and shocks, why these stresses and shocks exist in the first place. We are instead told to celebrate and commend these people for changing themselves. And what I want to turn to next is this idea of racism as potentially one of the worst man-made disasters. And I think it's important to call it as such, a man-made disaster, because race is ultimately a social construct. And its usage in the ways that we understand it now in terms of modern meaning really emerged from the 17th and 18th centuries. And they were a result of colonial expansion, as there was a need to differentiate between Europeans, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans in the quote unquote New World. So from the beginning, the concept of race was one of social ordering, of social hierarchy that pitted Black and Indigenous peoples at the bottom and had whiteness at the apex. And what's important here is that this social ordering, this social hierarchy continues to this day and is upheld to this day through systemic and structural racism, which refers to a system in which policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And the difficulty with these forms of systemic and structural racism is, again, that we're made to think of racism instead of a man-made event. We're made to see it as natural. We're made to see it as something, race always exists. There's always been preferences. There's always been this and that, when in fact it was a construction, it was a construct in order to dispossess people of their lands, to turn people into forms of economic output. And instead of really looking at the history of that, instead we see race as something that has always existed. And we don't actually observe the ways in which it's actually been embedded within our institutions, in our hiring practices, in the ways in which we treat people, even when we come to the hospital and we assume that Black women, for example, have a higher tolerance for pain. And all of these things are things that Black people are then meant to learn and adapt to and navigate throughout their lives. So as I mentioned before, because race is naturalized and racism is systemic, racialized communities are just labeled as vulnerable and at risk and are first forced to learn how to adapt. And there is never a questioning of why the systems at hand lead to the kinds of outcomes that we see, where the rates of unemployment are higher amongst particular racialized groups, Black Canadian communities being a key example. Instead, the labels are always put on the groups themselves in a way that takes away agency, but also doesn't actually put enough onus on the systems and the people who are upholding the systems, and government being one key example of this. And I know work is changing and there's been more of an acknowledgement of the ways in which systemic racism exists within all sorts of institutions. But the reality is that for Black people, there has been a need in order to continue to live, in order to survive, to acknowledge the ways in which you can't navigate the world in the same way, that you had to shift and conform and contort yourself in order to merely survive. And oftentimes, rather than change the systems, we've been told that we're resilient. And again, this is why I thought it was so important for me to take on this opportunity, because I think there is a need to retire that term. There is a need to think more critically about the structures at hand. There is a need to think about the ways in which we put so much pressure on individuals to continue to surmount obstacles that they should have never had to face in the first place. So from here, I'd like to turn to my own art practice. And my art practice, I've been producing work since about 2013. And initially, it really started off as a way of trying to create forms of representation that resonated more with me as a Black woman, having seen a lack of positive representations, or what I understood at the time as a young woman to be positive representations of Blackness. And in time, I realized that even though I was creating these beautiful portraits of Black women that felt uplifting, I was only scratching the surface. And what I really needed to do was to question the ways in which we are racialized altogether, and to question the way in which Blackness is treated as something that is deserving of punishment, that is deserving of surveillance, and so on. So my work really started to shift towards questioning and exploring the process of racialization altogether. And when I think about Blackness in Canada and the Black experience in Canada, I think back to a quote by Ronaldo Walcott, a renowned Black academic, that the experience of Blackness in Canada is that of an absentee presence. And I find this really particular because it speaks to one end of the Black experience, because there's this spectrum of visibility. So on one end, there's this enforced invisibility where you don't see yourself represented. And then on the other end, there's this hyper visibility. And you can think here of surveillance, you can think of hypercriminalization, and that's where you end up in this strange situation of Black people being underemployed, but also over incarcerated, and very much victims alongside Indigenous peoples of police brutality. And this particular installation of mine was from 2019, and this was on view at Axneo Set in Hull. And the title of this room, it's a two-part installation, but the title of this room is Since What I Might Be is Uncontainable. And this room was very much speaking to those politics of visibility, and specifically hypervisibility. And it stems from work by Frantz Fanon, a Martinican philosopher and psychiatrist. And he has this book called Black Skin, White Masks. And the 5th chapter of the book is the lived experience of the Black man. And it starts off with a kind of description of this encounter with a young white boy and his mother. And he describes the way in which, when the young white boy points at him and says, "Look, a Negro," he feels as though he's turned into an object. He feels as though he loses all control of his body and his limbs are pulled apart. And for me, the viscerality of that description really resonated with the feelings of racialization on a day-to-day basis, where you're trying to go to a shop and all of a sudden someone says something and you remember. You know, you're trying to do anything and all of a sudden you remember like the reality of your Blackness. And there's nothing wrong with Blackness, but it's the way in which it's treated. It's the way in which it changes the dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics. And this is not true always, but when it's so fully entrenched because of history, within systems, within institutions, within policies, it's inescapable, sorry. And what I really wanted to do with this work, and there were many different ways to interpret the piece, and that's one of the things I really liked about it, because people didn't know how they were meant to feel. But for a lot of people, there was a sense of discomfort. And I thought that that was really valuable, because that discomfort is my discomfort. It's the discomfort of having to navigate spaces that are never really meant for me. And the body parts are literally spread out throughout the room. So as you're walking, you're going to knock into a plexiglass piece of, a plexiglass limb, for example. Or if you're not close to a limb, then there's going to be a shadow that's either on the wall or potentially on your skin or on your clothes. But everywhere you go, there is that image of the Black body kind of exploded. And it's a way of kind of forcing the viewer into a space where race and racialization and the violence of of that process, the possibility of violence within that process can't be escaped. And the discomfort that is felt is intentional. And it is very much about the feelings I get within my body, having to deal with microaggressions on a daily basis, having to navigate a world that wasn't necessarily built for me or for me to succeed or for me to survive or thrive. So yeah, that's that piece. And what I also wanted to talk about and what I wanted to share with this particular image, this is an image of me that was taken at the same time as I was installing that artwork. So this is back in 2019. And this image was taken up by a friend, and unbeknownst to me and to that friend and to a lot of people, really, I was actually in the process of burning out. And I've included the definition of burnout on the side. But this was a time where, I was preparing this significant solo exhibition, but I was also working in government on a high profile file. I was also applying for master's programs and scholarships. I was developing public programming for my own solo exhibition, but also for another event in Toronto. And on top of it, there was a bed bug situation in my apartment building. So even just going home and trying to like have a good night's rest was just something I didn't even have the luxury of. And there was no kind of support that was extended towards me. When I was at the end of my rope and I tried to get support, I was told to keep pushing because they needed me and they needed my insights and etc. And it took me breaking down in my superior's office in order for me to get time off. And throughout this time, people had noticed that I wasn't okay, that I was different, but no one ever pointed me towards the resources that I needed. And there was just an assumption that I could keep going. And the other definition I've kind of put on the side here is the definition of weathering. And this is a concept that was coined by a Black woman doctor to really kind of describe the way in which this constant and sustained exposure to racism can lead to biological effects on Black bodies, can make them more vulnerable to chronic conditions such as heart disease and stroke and diabetes and cancer. And it's interesting because I mentioned race being this man-made disaster, this social construct. And the reality is that even if race is a social construct, racism makes race into something biological. And that is because of the impacts of racism on the body. It wears your body down. It wears your organs down. It changes your body, and there's an entire field of epigenetics that's looking at things like this. But that is the reality that we're living in. And the works I had shown, the works I was creating at the same time I was burning out, were all about the impacts of living in a world like this on my body and how it was pulling my body apart, So I just find that there's, when I think back to it, especially in the context of resilience and burnout, there's just so much to be said there. And I just wanted to say something I wrote down as well, is that this is actually what happens when resilience becomes the main framework from which we operate. People are left to save themselves from drowning in situations that they should have never been put in the first place. And so this has not been the most positive kind of start to the presentation. And I think it's important to be very honest about the realities of what we're talking about, especially when you take a word that has so many kind of positive connotations, such as resilience. I think it's important to be critical. And I think it's important to really think through the impacts and the effects that such a word and the way we use it, the way it impacts the people it's meant to celebrate, because it actually does more harm than good. So from here, I kind of want to shift the conversation altogether. And I think that's part of what this presentation is really about, is shifting from a focus on resilience to something different. And I don't know that regenerative is necessarily the best thing. All I know is that it's another option. And I think it's one that needs to be explored. So what's food got to do with it? And it's interesting. So I mentioned my work in government. I've worked in government for about 5 years now. And the first department I worked at was the Department for Food, Agriculture and Food. Now I'm forgetting the actual name of the department. But I was there from about 2016 to 2019, if not more. And I worked on a range of different issues, from grain transportation to biodiversity. But the last file I worked on was the development of a national food policy. And in that position, I was leading engagement with Indigenous communities. But more broadly, having worked at the department and having worked on food issues, one of the things I was introduced to was this concept of regenerative agriculture. And that's where that idea of regeneration comes from me. It's a shift from a focus on food systems that competes with nature to one that partners with nature. Instead of disturbing the soil, you treat the soil and ecosystems as foundational to the health and productivity of, and even productivity can sometimes be kind of problematic as a frame, but the productivity of food systems. It's not about monoculture, it's about diversity, and it's holistic in its approach. And as I was doing the work of engaging with Indigenous communities, and I'll speak about that a little bit more in the next slide, one of the things I realized is that a lot of these principles around regenerative agriculture are actually in a way rooted in Indigenous worldviews that very much prioritize reciprocity with all things in nature, including the land, including the soil, including animals. That is all about holistic approaches, that is about partnership and kinship. And I really started to feel and understand what regeneration meant and how it's linked to reciprocity and kinship as I was doing this work, as I mentioned, of Indigenous engagement. So from about 2017 to 2019, I was able to visit communities across Canada. So these photos were taken in Nain, Nunatsiavut, which is, Nain is the northernmost community of Nunatsiavut, and Nunatsiavut is one of the 4 Inuit regions of Inuit Nunangat. But I also traveled to Yellowknife, and I also traveled to Thunder Bay, and I was having conversations with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis folks about their food systems. And I was learning about the importance of food, not only for culture, but also the political elements of food. And it got me rethinking my own relationship to food. And I started to realize and think about the rates of food insecurity and how high they were, not only amongst Indigenous people, but also among Black Canadians. I started to think about the concept of food deserts that really speaks to a lack of access to nutritious and healthy foods within certain urban areas, and how that's being transitioned to a focus on food apartheid that again sees, like, the term food desert makes it sound natural, like it just happens to be like that. Whereas using the term food apartheid makes you realize that it's a man-made issue. There are systems that have been built in this particular way to make it such that some communities want to have access to the foods that they need to be safe, healthy. So food apartheid is another kind of like really interesting concept. But altogether, really questioning so many things that I had taken for granted, and thinking a lot about kinship, thinking about solidarity, thinking about what it meant to be a Black woman representing government, going into communities and thinking about what it is that I could do to build different, otherwise relationships with Indigenous folks. Think about how we can heal together, knowing that we had been harmed by similar systems. And I knew I couldn't do that through my job, so I turned to art as a way of addressing that instead. So what ended up happening is that I curated this exhibition called They Forgot That We Were Seeds. And this was an exhibition that was on display at the Carleton University Art Gallery from February to April 2020. It was cut short by the pandemic. And it featured 8 Black and Indigenous women artists. So Casey Adams, Deanna Bowen, Roxana Farrell, Bushra Junaid, Amy Malbeuf, Meryl McMaster, Cheyenne Sundance, and Catherine Tikpani. And it was a way for me to bring these different women together to kind of explore the relationship that they have with each other, so Black and Indigenous women, and the relationship that they both individually and collectively have to this land that we call Canada, through the lens of food. So it touched on issues of land, migration, and food justice, and really focused on the history of trade and both goods and peoples in Canada's history as a settler colonial nation. And although a lot of the work spoke to the past and its ongoing effects on the present, There were works by two artists that really spoke to different ways of envisioning a future that's decolonial. And by decolonial, I mean that's actively working to dismantle colonialism and coloniality in all of its forms. So this particular piece was it's not an actual photo of the piece. Unfortunately, one of the things with the pandemic interfering is that we didn't get photos of this piece, which was plants literally growing in the gallery. But this is a piece by Cheyenne Sundance, and she's a Toronto-based urban farmer. And what she did is that she turned to nature, and she turned to the patterns within nature to speak to the different kinds of relationship that are possible between Native people and non-Native people on this land. So she took three different plants, dogwood, which is native to North America, and then there is English ivy and sweet peas, which are both non-native and actually come from England, I believe. And what she did is that she planted the dogwood, the ivy, and the sweet peas together. And what you'll see happen is that the ivy is a plant that just kind of sprawls and covers everything and kind of chokes off growth for the other plants. Whereas sweet peas have a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria in the soil and with the earthworms. So it's actually helping the soil. It's feeding the soil as it's wrapping around the ivy and growing, and eventually feeding the audience who can then eat the sweet peas. And what you're seeing is two different dynamics. There's one that's a relationship of extraction and kind of you're not giving anything back. And the other one is one that's much more characterized by reciprocity. And what you end up having is a fruit is born of that wouldn't have been possible without that kind of engagement. And I think with that piece, especially with this emphasis on food, you can see how Black and Indigenous peoples growing food on the land in order to feed their communities is such a form of justice, and it brings us to a potential future that is brighter than what we could have had in the past. The other piece that I want to talk about from the same exhibition is a piece by Catherine Tikpani, who is an Ottawa-based Inuk artist who's also part of the show. And what we worked very closely together throughout this entire process. And what her piece ended up being was a documentation of an event that we organized. And this was a public programming event for the exhibition itself. So what the event was a private gathering and dinner for Black and Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. And it took place before the exhibition actually opened. So the exhibition opened in February and this event took place in November. And it was really important for me to have this moment to just have a dinner. Having had sort of similar opportunities with my job, but feeling that because of my position in government, there wasn't that kinship, there wasn't that trust. I wanted to create a space where we could come together and just be. And that was key because oftentimes when you think about the gathering of these two marginalized groups, I've seen it mainly at vigils. I've seen it mainly at protests, oftentimes to protest the death of Black and Indigenous people at the hands of the police. So it's always in the context of suffering and oppression. And we never get the chance to just come together and share a meal, to cook for one another, to plate each other's food and sit down and just talk and laugh. And that was what this moment was. And I think when you think about resilience, there wasn't like, we did share some of the things that we struggled with, but it wasn't about that. It wasn't a moment to celebrate our resilience. That is not what it was intended for at all. It was a moment to take care of one another. It was a moment to feed one another. It was a moment for regeneration. So there's this quote here by Perel Segal, and it says, what seems to me to get people through these kinds of trauma are other people. It's an ability and an opportunity to talk about one's pain. It is an opportunity to be vulnerable and to change and dictate the course of one's life. And, I want to emphasize, it's not just about pain, it's just about getting to know each other. It's about really being able to explore the fullness of our own humanities, because it's so much more than just the suffering. And moments like this are so key for that reason. And this is just another photo from that event. And this is us in a sharing circle. So what I did, because I knew that I had been in government for quite a bit, and I find that sometimes the way government engages through consultative processes, it's very extractive. And I didn't want to replicate that within this space. So along with the Carleton University Art Gallery, we actually hired 2 independent facilitators, Muna Mohammed, a young Black woman, and Cole Poplinsky, a Two-Spirit Algonquin and Métis individual. And they were the ones that really, emphasize this, that this isn't a space to share trauma. This is a space to hold space for one another. And they set up the sharing circle, and they set up the long table, and they decided how the event would take place in a lot of ways. And I let them run with it because I knew I had to unlearn a lot of the things I had learned. And when it came time to actually including the documentation in the exhibition, what you have are just a couple photos that provide you with a glimpse of what happened and what we were able to create. And I think that's important because there's often this potential for voyeurism when you have moments like this where it's easily consumed. And this isn't for other people's consumption. This was always just for us. So I think with my work, I'm also, as a curator, I'm navigating this thin line between kind of visibility and voyeurism, and what to share and what to keep, because ultimately it's about our own safety. It's about our own ability to see ourselves reflected as we really are, to be able to come into spaces as we are, and to be able to keep that to ourselves when we know the world would necessarily create space for those otherwise ways of being. So I'm just going to ask Marwan, and am I still okay for time, or do you guys want me to kind of cut it short?
I'll keep going as you are.
Okay.
You have about 7 minutes.
Okay, cool. So with the last section, I kind of want to go back to my own art practice and to talk about this shift from Black death to Black aliveness, and really trying to shift the conversation around Blackness. And I'd like to read a quote from Kevin Quashie. And Kevin Quashie is this amazing academic whose work I've been reading for a while now. He has a book that's out now called Black Aliveness, or Poetics of Being. But the first work of his that I'd read was The Sovereignty of Quiet. But this is a quote from Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being. And it reads, what would it mean to consider Black aliveness, especially given how readily and literally Blackness is indexed to death? To behold such aliveness, we have to imagine a Black world. We have to imagine a Black world so as to surpass the everywhere and every way of Black death, of Blackness that is understood only through such a vocabulary. This equation of Blackness and death is indisputable and enduring, surely, but if we want to try to conceptualize aliveness, we have to begin somewhere else. And I think about this quote a lot nowadays as I have a bit of a break with being at school, to kind of think back on my practice and think back on the ways it's evolved. And, I think it's important that I've spoken about racialization, and I've spoken about the impacts on my body and the ways in which it feels very constricting. But at the same time, that's only one part of the conversation. And I feel like so often we're distracted. And I think back to actually Toni Morrison's words when she was talking about the function of racism. She talks about the function of racism actually being distraction. It distracts you from living your life. It distracts you from enjoying this short moment that we have on Earth. So with all of that in mind, I was really excited in 2020 when I was given the opportunity to be part of a group exhibition curated by Genevieve Wallen at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. And the themes for the exhibition were the sun, Black and brown bodies, and pleasure. And it was the first time I was being invited to be in a group exhibition, that wasn't centered on, Blackness and Black and brown bodies and resistance or resilience, right? Those are often the thematics that are used, but instead to think about something like pleasure. And I turned to Kevin Quashie's book on the sovereignty of quiet. And in that book, he kind of talks about another book by Gwendolyn Brooks called Maud Martha, which is a series of vignettes about Maud Martha, the protagonist of the book. And the book actually starts off with a list of things that Maud Martha loves. So this is the first line in the book, quote unquote, what sorry, quote, what she liked was candy buttons and books and painted music, deep blue or delicate silver, and the west sky so all-terrain viewed from the steps of the back porch and dandelions, end quote. And for me, when I read that, and when I read also Kevin Kwashi's analysis of that particular passage, what you start to realize is that Maud Martha, this young Black woman who we see grow up from a child to a young woman, is introduced by a list of the things she loves. She's introduced as a desiring subject. She's introduced through her pleasures. And that's something that's not common when you think about Blackness. And with that in mind, I gave myself the challenge of coming up with a list of things that I loved. So I spent a couple months doing that. And you can see on the right side, one example of some of the things I jotted down. And I created this list, and keeping in mind the theme of the exhibition, I put that list on vinyls. I printed them on vinyls and pasted them on the windows and the ceilings of the hall in the gallery. So what happens is that when you have the sun up in the sky, you have the shadows that are cast of those words onto the gallery walls. But what's kind of interesting here is that you can't actually read what's said. And the question becomes, who is this for? Who is the actual audience? And part of that is kind of realizing that we don't often make space for otherwise ways of encountering Black womanhood. And I know this may be like a lot of quotes, but I really do think that these quotes are really important. So this is a quote from Bell Hooks, and she says, time and time again, Black women are called to only speak from that space in the margin that is a sign of deprivation, of a wound, an unfilled longing, to speak essentially only of their pain. And if that's what the world expects, if that's what we see all the time, how do we expect other people to understand us otherwise? And if we don't expect us to understand us as we put our pleasure first, who do we speak to? Who do we turn to? Who do we expect to actually listen? And for me here, I turn to the sun. I turn to nature as something that could understand my desires, that could understand this prayer in many ways that I was sending up. And I think there's always that question of audience in my work, and that question of who can I share certain elements of myself with, and what should I withhold, and what do I think can be legible and what can't. And I think there's agency there. There's agency, and I think it's really beautiful, and it's something I definitely want to continue with in my work. But ultimately, this is me exploring myself in ways that I've never really gotten the chance to. And I think going forward, when I think about this concept of Black aliveness, this is it. This is just the beginning for me, but this is where I want to go. And I think to really wrap things up, and there's one more slide, and I'll talk really briefly about that slide. But I really wanted to end with this quote from Zendeshi, and this is a Black woman writer and director. And what she says is, I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want support. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many. And I think this really encapsulates a lot of the things I think about when I think about resilience, where I don't want it to be about strength. I want it to be about kinship. I want it to be about support. I want it to be about those places that I can find where I'm allowed to be soft. And I think I want to then really end on what I mentioned in terms of vulnerability and creating spaces where people can come as they are. And I'm happy I shared what I shared in the beginning about being nervous, because I had another panel at 1:30, from midnight to 1:30 a.m. my time here, because I'm in London. And I've had this one, and it's been a really difficult and challenging year. And I'm sure it's been the same for everyone, the past 2 years, really. And I think going forward, what's needed is spaces like this, spaces where people can come as they are and speak honestly and speak fully about, the fullness of who they are, the things they're struggling with, the things that they're having a hard time with. And I wanted to end with this photo of myself from grade 6. So this is a photo from my graduation book from grade 6, because this is ultimately why I do the work that I do. I do it for the young Black girl that I was, who really struggled moving from Nigeria to Canada and having to grapple with what it means to be just Black, no longer Nigerian, no longer Igbo, just Black. And I do it for me as a young woman. I do it for the other girls who look like me. I do it for future me as well. I do it for me because it's important that we create these spaces, that we create these opportunities, and we create these narratives such that we're allowed to come as we are. We're allowed to ask for softness. We're allowed to ask for support. We're allowed to ask for kinship, and that we'll be given those spaces. So with that, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And now I'm going to stop share so I can actually see people's faces, because I've just been looking at this presentation screen and I don't know what's been going on.
Good luck with balancing an artist career with government work, with an advocacy role. It is incredibly difficult. I also had a government position, which could be creative, but could not be creative with the constructs, and tried to balance that with my own work, which some of it's behind me here, and to create an art practice. And it's not easy. And so I say, good luck. You're going to need strength. You don't need necessarily soft pats on the back. You're going to need strength to carry on. But I think you've got the foundation for it. So good luck on that journey.
Thank you.
It's not really a question, it's just a statement, but you've got a lot of work ahead of you.
Hi, Kosi. I wanted to ask you about your work and this new sort of season in your life, and being in the UK, going through COVID. When you do come back to Ottawa, do you think that these new experiences and this new stuff will impact your work? And how do you think it will impact your work? Specifically as an artist.
Which new stuff exactly?
I mean, basically the fact that we're going through a pandemic. And you mentioned so many beautiful things about what has impacted your work in terms of a lot of different thinkers. And of course, I think we can see this in your current work, but I'm just curious as to, as you move forward, coming back from the UK after the pandemic, back to Ottawa. I mean, of course, you won't know this until you get here, but I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are about the new directions that your work may take.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. I think in terms of the new directions, I don't really know. I do and I don't. So I am currently studying, and it's an interdisciplinary program. So as much as I do work in policy and some of the program is really oriented towards that, it's also introduced me to a lot of theoretical debates, which has been really great. So I'm really, really interested in decoloniality. And I don't know that I necessarily spoke of a lot of decolonial authors in this presentation, but I've been reading a lot of their work and still grappling with it. And I think what decoloniality asks for is a total kind of deconstruction of the systems at hand, but in a way that's different from post-colonialism or other kind of theoretical frameworks, because it's looking further behind. It's looking back to otherwise ways of being, and it's looking towards multiplicity in different ways. So looking at a multiverse. So all of these different ideas, like, I don't know how exactly they're going to transform my practice, but they're the ideas that are floating around in my head at the moment. In terms of other ways in which, like, this year has changed me, we can talk about school, we can talk about other things, but at the end of the day, like, this has been a really transformative year for me, just generally on personal side as well. And I think it's taught me a lot of compassion. It's taught me, I've always had strength. I mean, to do the work that I do, and I've been doing this since I was about 20, that requires strength. I've always had that. But I think there's a different kind of strength that I'm stepping into. And I don't fully know what that looks like yet, but I can feel the difference. And I look forward to kind of like learning and getting used to this latest, newest version of myself. But there's a lot of compassion there. And there's a willingness and desire to really change things, and in a way that doesn't make space for forcing people into boxes anymore, that is looking for radical solutions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I found every single word of this presentation nourishing. I used to be really proud of being resilient as a Bangladeshi Muslim immigrant to Canada. And I've really been rethinking that over the last couple of years. I wanted to know what your thoughts were on what I've been seeing now and it's been really hard for me, is that sort of rest is a form of resistance, and like having this totally different idea of rest, and not just resilience. Like I'm starting to learn, or I guess unlearn, about capitalism and how I and maybe many others have this like internalized capitalism where we feel like we have to be productive all the time, and we feel really guilty for taking breaks. I didn't realize how true that was maybe until the pandemic. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that, and maybe the connections between rest and resilience and some of the other beautiful things you shared today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shamima. So I think that's definitely really important. And I don't know if you follow them on Instagram, but there's a group called the Nap Industry. And I've been following their work, and it's been really helping me in terms of moving away from being a workaholic, because I think it's pretty clear to see that I'm a workaholic, and I like to call myself a recovering workaholic at this point. And in many ways, the pandemic was kind of a blessing because it's forced me to a standstill over the course of last summer. And that was really difficult at first because I'm someone who's constantly doing things. And when I don't do something, I don't know what to do with myself. So for a couple of months, I had nothing. And I turned to a lot of self-help books. I turned to spirituality. I read up on Buddhism. I read up on anything that could help me through that process. And I rested. I was forced to a place of stillness, and I rested a lot. And I found since then that I always create time for rest. I create time for naps. I create time for walks. I go to the gym. I do anything that makes me feel more rooted in my body. And I think that's what's gotten me through this year. And I'm grateful for that, So 100% resting is important. It is definitely like a capitalist system, like depends on us overworking ourselves and being easily exploitable. So take your time back, take it back.
I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit out of time. I wish we had more time for the two remaining questions, but please, Kosi's trying to get a bit more bumping on Twitter. So feel free to reach out to her there and ask these additional questions and engage with her there as well.